The story of the real Wild Bill Hickok, the most humiliating downfall of a Western legend, begins with a jarring, almost unbelievable contrast. Place two opposing images side by side. A trembling, heavily intoxicated man dressed in an absurd buckskin suit, paraded as a circus monkey for wealthy Eastern elites who point and laugh from the shadows. Next to him, the ultimate apex predator of the American West, a lethal gunfighter whose mere silhouette made every hardened outlaw run cold. Long before a coward's bullet found his back in Deadwood, the ruthless entertainment machine had already slaughtered the eagle of the plains. Trapped by poverty, he was forced onto a New York stage to perform his own life as a cheap theatrical trick, enduring the agonizing glare of limelights that literally burned away his failing eyesight night after night. When a legendary warrior is stripped of his dignity and reduced to a blind, mocked sideshow attraction, it forces us to ask, is there any force on earth more destructive than a price tag hung around a human soul? The descent into this trap was paved by the raw material from which James Butler Hickok was forged. Born in 1837 in Illinois, Hickok entered an unforgiving landscape defined by isolation and sudden violence. The American frontier was not a romantic cinematic playground. It was an abrasive meat grinder. A firearm was not a prop. It was a utilitarian tool of survival. Young Hickok learned early that out on the plains there were no courts of appeal. There was no higher authority than the speed of one's hands and the cold detachment of one's mind. This environment did not create a hot-headed killer, it created a pragmatist. The men who survived the frontier were not the loudest or the most aggressive in the saloon. They were the most observant. Hickok possessed an inherent terrifying stillness. Even as a young man, contemporaries noted his distinct lack of nervous energy. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a deliberate, almost feline grace. But it was his eyes that unsettled people, a piercing blue-gray that seemed to process the world in slow motion, constantly scanning, categorizing threats, and calculating distances. When the Civil War erupted, this cold pragmatism found its perfect theater. The conflict in the border states of Kansas and Missouri was not a war of gentlemanly tactics or organized front lines. It was a vicious, intimate bloodbath of guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and midnight raids. Hickok plunged into this abyss, serving as a scout, a spy, and a sharpshooter for the Union Army. It was here, in the moral vacuum of bleeding Kansas, that James Butler Hickok began to disappear, and the architecture of Wild Bill was erected. War teaches many things, but for a man of Hickok's particular psychological makeup, it provided a master class in the absolute finality of violence. He learned the vital difference between pulling a trigger out of panic and pulling a trigger as a calculated physical equation. Most men, when faced with the immediate prospect of their own death, experience a massive dump of adrenaline that destroys their fine motor skills. Their hands shake, their vision narrows, and they fire blindly, desperately hoping to hit something. Hickok possessed the rare, chilling neurological wiring that allowed his heart rate to remain steady under fire. He did not freeze, and he did not rush. This is the secret to his lethal reputation. It was not merely speed, it was total, unwavering deliberation in the face of chaos. He was a master craftsman, and his medium was death. This lethal craftsmanship was etched into American folklore on July 21st, 1865, in Springfield, Missouri. In a trivial dispute over a poker debt, Hickok faced a gambler named Davis Tutt. at 75 yards, a massive gap for the revolvers of the era. Tut panicked and fired wildly. Hickok did not flinch. He rested his heavy barrel across his forearm and fired a single, mathematically precise shot directly through Tut's heart. It was a display of icy nerve so spectacular that it birthed the cinematic legend of the quick-draw duel. The story was picked up by regional newspapers and highly sensationalized in Harper's New Monthly magazine, cementing the high noon showdown into the American consciousness. Overnight, Hickok was transformed from a skilled frontier operative into a national celebrity. But for Hickok, this was not a coronation. It was a death warrant. The public consumption of his lethal skill stripped away his anonymity, the most valuable asset a frontier survivor possesses. With his name now synonymous with deadly force, Hickok found employment where his reputation could be weaponized, as a lawman in the booming cattle towns of Kansas. Towns like Hays City and Abilene were not quaint communities. They were volatile economic engines, fueled by massive cattle drives arriving from Texas. The drovers who brought these cattle north were exhausted, heavily armed, and flush with cash. When they hit the saloons and brothels of Kansas, the result was an explosion of violence, gambling, and vice. The town councils did not hire Hickok to be a peace officer in any modern sense of the word. They hired him as a highly paid executioner to protect their commercial interests. They needed a man whose mere presence on the boardwalk would cause drunken cowboys to check their behavior. They needed a monster to keep the other monsters at bay. Hickok ruled these towns with an iron fist and a pair of ivory-handled revolvers. He did not arrest people through negotiation. He dominated them through sheer intimidating physical presence and the unspoken promise of instant death. He patrolled the streets, walking in the center of the road, avoiding the shadows of the storefronts where an assassin might hide. His methods were brutal, efficient, and often extrajudicial. He was known to beat unruly drunks with the barrel of his gun rather than risk a protracted struggle. When he did draw his weapons, the result was almost always fatal. He killed several men during his tenure as a lawman, each death adding another layer of blood to the growing monument of his legend. But the psychological cost of maintaining this position at the apex of a violent food chain is catastrophic to the human nervous system. A man cannot live indefinitely in a state of hypervigilance without his mind beginning to fracture. Hickok transitioned from being the hunter to being the hunted. His fame had bred a toxic, parasitic phenomenon, the young, ambitious punk who wanted to make a name for himself. Every time Hickok walked into a saloon, he knew that somewhere in the room there might be a kid with a cheap pistol and a head full of dime novel fantasies, looking to become the man who killed Wild Bill. The paranoia set in like a slow-acting poison. Hickok could no longer sit with his back to a door or a window. He could not sleep deeply. Every sudden sound, every unexpected movement triggered a massive spike of adrenaline. He was trapped in a permanent state of combat readiness. The legend that the Eastern newspapers had so eagerly constructed was now a suffocating weight. The citizens of the towns he protected looked at him not with gratitude, but with a mixture of awe and revulsion. They wanted the security his guns provided, but they did not want to look too closely at the man who wielded them. He was a necessary evil, a tool of civilization that was too savage for the civilization it was protecting. The great tragedy of this era in Hickok's life is the profound isolation of his expertise. He was surrounded by people, yet completely alone. No one could truly comprehend the specific suffocating pressure of knowing that your life depends entirely on being a fraction of a second faster than every stranger you meet. He began to drink, not yet to the point of ruin, but enough to take the edge off the razor-sharp tension that hummed in his nerves. The cold, calculating machine that had dominated the Springfield Square was beginning to wear down from the friction of its own existence. The myth of Wild Bill Hickok was complete, a towering, indestructible monolith in the American imagination. But beneath the surface, the man carrying the weight of that myth was slowly, quietly cracking. The stage was set for a fall, not by the bullet of a faster gunfighter, but by an internal collapse and a twist of fate that would strip him of his most vital weapon, leaving the apex predator entirely defenseless against the encroaching shadows. The illusion of absolute control is the most dangerous narcotic a man can consume, and by the spring of 1871, James Butler Hickok had consumed it entirely. The catastrophic breaking point of his life arrived exactly at the absolute zenith of his earthly power, Abilene, Kansas. At that time, Abilene was not merely a town. It was a violent, chaotic collision of geography and economics. It sat at the terminus of the legendary Chisholm Trail, the sprawling artery through which hundreds of thousands of Texas longhorn cattle were driven north to the railheads. For months, the Texas drovers, hardened, exhausted, and deeply resentful of Northern authority following the Civil War, endured stampedes, river crossings, and Native American skirmishes. When they finally reached Abilene, they were flush with wages and starved for release. They descended upon the town's saloons, brothels, and gambling halls like a locust swarm of adrenaline and whiskey. The town was a powder keg, and the previous city marshal, a well-respected man named Tom Smith, had recently been decapitated with an axe while trying to serve a warrant. In a state of absolute desperation, the businessmen of Abilene City Council realized that standard law enforcement was obsolete. They did not need a policeman, they needed a warlord. They sent for Wild Bill. When Hickok arrived in Abilene, he was offered an exorbitant salary of $150 a month, plus a percentage of all collected fines. It was an astronomical sum for the era, reflecting the sheer terror the town council felt toward the Texas drovers. Hickok established his headquarters in the Alamo Saloon, the epicenter of Abilene's vice. He rarely patrolled in the traditional sense. He simply existed in the center of the room, a looming, immaculate predator dressed in tailored broadcloth, a silk vest, and his twin ivory-handled Colts perfectly positioned on his hips. His method of peacekeeping was psychological warfare. He knew that the threat of violence was far more efficient than the act of violence itself. He maintained an icy, terrifying detachment, staring down mobs of drunken cowboys with a gaze that promised instantaneous death. For a time, it worked perfectly. The violent crime rate plummeted. Hickok had become the undisputed king of the frontier, a man whose reputation was so massive that it seemed to bend the reality of the town around his will. But the fatal flaw of relying entirely on lethal precision is that a single mistake is irreversible. And for a man whose nerves were tightly wound like a coiled spring from years of hypervigilance, that mistake was inevitable. The fracturing of Wild Bill Hickok's soul occurred on the evening of October 5th, 1871, during a confrontation that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The cattle season was drawing to a close, and a large group of Texans, led by a prominent gambler and saloon owner named Phil Coe, were engaged in a final, raucous celebration in the streets. Coe and Hickok possessed a deep, simmering mutual hatred. They were rival apex predators in a confined ecosystem, their animosity fueled by a mixture of regional prejudice, professional jealousy, and, according to local whispers, a shared romantic interest in a woman named Jessie Hazel. As the night darkened, the drunken Texans began moving down Texas Street, causing a massive disturbance. Suddenly, a gunshot echoed through the cold autumn air. Hickok, who was eating dinner at the nearby Brennan's Hotel, immediately rushed into the street, bursting through the swinging doors of the Alamo Saloon to confront the mob. He demanded to know who had fired the weapon within city limits. Phil Coe stepped forward, a revolver in his hand, and claimed he had only been shooting at a stray dog. The air in the street froze. This was not about a dog. It was a direct public challenge to Hickok's authority from a leader of the Texas faction. In the dim flickering light of the kerosene street lamps, surrounded by a hostile crowd of armed men, the mathematics of survival activated in Hickok's brain. Coe raised his weapon and fired at Hickok, the bullet tearing through Wild Bill's heavy coat, narrowly missing his torso. The legendary reflexes, honed through years of guerrilla warfare and deadly duels, took over. In a fraction of a second, Hickok drew his twin Colts and fired. Coe was struck twice in the stomach, staggering backward, mortally wounded. The threat had been neutralized with the chilling efficiency that the dime novels love to glorify. But the tragedy of real violence is that it is never as clean or as isolated as fiction portrays. As the smoke from the heavy black powder revolvers billowed in the street, obscuring the dim light, the chaotic noise of the crowd roared in Hickok's ears. His adrenaline was surging at maximum capacity, his nervous system locked into a state of total, indiscriminate combat readiness. He was scanning the periphery, expecting the rest of the Texas mob to draw their weapons and unleash a barrage of return fire. In that split second of supreme, terrified focus, a shadowy figure suddenly broke from the crowd and rushed directly toward Hickok from the periphery of his vision. Conditioned by a lifetime of surviving ambushes, Hickok's body reacted before his conscious mind could process the identity of the running figure. He pivoted, instinctively dropping his aim, and fired 2 rapid shots into the approaching silhouette. The figure collapsed instantly in the dirt. As the gun smoke slowly drifted away on the Kansas wind, Hickok stepped forward to examine the second threat he had just eliminated. The man lying dead in the dust was not a Texas cowboy. It was Mike Williams, Hickok's own friend and special deputy, who had been running to his aid, rushing into the line of fire to support his chief. The psychological devastation of this moment cannot be overstated. Eyewitness accounts report a visceral, horrifying transformation in Hickok. The icy, untouchable warlord vanished in an instant. Realizing what he had done, Hickok dropped to his knees in the dirt, weeping uncontrollably. He gathered Williams's lifeless body into his arms, screaming in anguish. He carried his dead friend into the Alamo Saloon, his pristine clothes soaked in Williams's blood, and laid him on a billiard table. Hickok paid for the funeral expenses and traveled to break the news to Williams's young wife, a task that reportedly shattered whatever remained of his emotional armor. The killing of Mike Williams broke something fundamental within James Butler Hickok. His entire identity, his justification for the immense violence he had inflicted upon the world, rested on the belief that his lethal skills were perfectly controlled, righteous, and precise. He was the protector. He was the man who could navigate the chaos and strike only the guilty. To pull the trigger and kill an innocent friend destroyed that narrative completely. The internal architecture of his ego collapsed. Furthermore, the incident provided the Abilene City Council with the perfect excuse to rid themselves of him. The era of the wild cattle drives was ending. Farmers with barbed wire were arriving, and the businessmen wanted to attract families, not gamblers. 2 months later, in December 1871, the city council quietly dismissed Hickok. They no longer needed a killer. The era of the gunfighter lawman in Abilene was over. Hickok left Abilene a deeply traumatized and unemployed man. But the psychological wounds were about to be compounded by a physical betrayal that was in many ways far more terrifying. As the calendar turned into 1872, the Eagle of the Plains began to experience a profound deterioration of the very instrument that had guaranteed his survival, his eyesight. The cruel irony of this affliction was rooted deeply in the punishing medical reality of the 19th century frontier. The Great Plains were an environment of relentless physical hostility. For decades, Hickok had lived under the brutal, unfiltered ultraviolet radiation of the high plains sun. He had ridden through blinding blizzards, suffocating dust storms, and the caustic alkaline dirt that constantly blew across the Kansas and Nebraska territories. Medical historians analyzing his symptoms point to advanced trachoma or early onset glaucoma, brought on by years of exposure to the caustic dust and blinding sun of the plains. The exact diagnosis matters less than the devastating reality. The pressure building inside his eyes was slowly crushing his optic nerve. For a man whose survival depended entirely on scanning a crowded room and identifying microscopic physical tells, this was an agonizing death sentence. His peripheral vision, his vital early warning radar, was failing, slowly plunging the edges of his world into absolute darkness. For a man of ordinary means, going blind on the frontier was a tragedy. For Wild Bill Hickok, it was an extended, agonizing death sentence. The sheer mechanics of his survival relied entirely on sight. Hickok did not survive simply because he could shoot a tin can off a fence post at 20 paces. He survived because his eyes were capable of scanning a crowded, smoke-filled saloon and instantly identifying the microscopic physical tells of a man preparing to draw a weapon. He survived by reading the tension in a stranger's jaw, the slight shift of weight in their shoulders, the movement of a hand lingering too close to a coat pocket. His peripheral vision was his early warning radar system. Now that system was failing. The edges of his world were growing blurry, shadowed, and indistinct. The terror of this realization must have been suffocating. Imagine walking into a room knowing that a dozen men might want to kill you for the sheer fame of it, and simultaneously realizing that you can no longer clearly see the faces of the men standing at the edges of the bar. The loss of his sight robbed him of his depth perception, making the complex mathematics of a gunfight impossible to calculate. He began to wear dark tinted glasses, an incredibly rare accessory for a man in the 1870s, attempting to shield his raw, aching eyes from the punishing glare of the sun. The man who had possessed the most feared gaze in the American West was now hiding his eyes behind smoked glass, terrified that the criminal underworld would discover his fatal weakness. The apex predator was rapidly becoming wounded prey. This physical deterioration accelerated his descent into a terrifying economic abyss. Hickok's skill set was incredibly narrow. He knew how to ride, he knew how to scout, and he knew how to kill. By 1873, none of those skills were marketable. The Indian wars on the Central Plains were largely transitioning into localized skirmishes, reducing the military's need for highly paid civilian scouts. The major cattle towns had transitioned to established police forces. Hickok was a relic of a vanished era, attempting to survive in a rapidly modernizing world that had fundamentally outgrown him. He drifted aimlessly across the West, moving through Colorado, Wyoming, and Missouri like a ghost haunting the boomtowns he had once commanded. He attempted to sustain himself through professional gambling, which had always been a secondary source of income for frontier lawmen. But the cruelty of his failing eyesight made this, too, an impossibility. In the dim, smoke-filled interiors of the frontier casinos, illuminated only by flickering oil lamps, Hickok found himself unable to clearly read the cards in his own hand, let alone study the expressions of his opponents across the table. Men who would never have dared to look him in the eye a few years earlier were now routinely cheating him, quietly siphoning away his dwindling funds. He was losing his money, he was losing his sight, and most devastatingly, he was losing his autonomy. The poverty that gripped Hickok in the mid-1870s was not merely a lack of funds, it was a profound systemic humiliation. He was arguably the most famous living man in the American West. Penny dreadfuls and dime novels bearing his name and highly fictionalized likeness were selling tens of thousands of copies in New York and Boston. Playwrights were writing melodramas about his exploits. Gun makers were using his legend to sell revolvers. The entire American cultural apparatus was quietly minting a fortune off the intellectual property of his violent life. Yet the man himself was entirely cut off from this wealth. There were no royalties, no licensing fees, no pensions for former lawmen whose nerves had been shattered in the line of duty. The myth of Wild Bill Hickok was a lucrative, soaring enterprise. While James Butler Hickok was struggling to pay for a hot meal and a bed in a cheap boarding house, he was trapped in an agonizing paradox. His colossal fame prevented him from taking menial, ordinary labor. He could not quietly sweep the floors of a mercantile store or haul freight without drawing a massive, gaping crowd of onlookers, eager to stare at the fallen king. He was a prisoner of his own mythology, starving inside a monument built to honor his lethal past. He began to borrow money from old acquaintances, the indignity of debt stripping away the final layers of his fierce independence. The majestic, terrifying eagle of the plains was grounded, his wings broken by trauma, his eyes clouded by disease, his pockets completely empty. He was a man drowning in the shadows of his own legend, standing at the absolute edge of desperation. It was precisely at this moment of maximum vulnerability, when pride had been entirely eroded by hunger and fear, that the capitalist entertainment machine of the East would arrive, not to rescue him, but to purchase the hollowed-out remnants of his life for the amusement of a paying audience. Desperation possesses a specific, crushing gravity. It pulls a man downward, stripping away layers of pride until only the raw, pulsating instinct for survival remains. By the late months of 1873, James Butler Hickok was caught entirely within this gravitational pull. The legendary gunfighter was destitute, navigating the edges of frontier towns in borrowed coats, his famously sharp eyes hiding behind dark glass to conceal their milky decay. He was a man starving to death inside a monument built to his own lethal glory. It was precisely in this crucible of absolute vulnerability that the capitalist machinery of the East extended a lifeline. But it was not a rope of rescue. It was a gilded chain, and the man holding the other end of that chain was an old acquaintance who had mastered the very transition that Hickok found impossible. William F. Cody, known to the world as Buffalo Bill. The agonizing transaction that followed exposed a profound divergence between the two men. Both were authentic products of the violent plains. Both had served as scouts, ridden through hostile territories, and possessed genuine frontier credentials. But while Hickok remained rigidly bound to the authentic, deadly code of the West, Cody recognized that the true gold rush of the 1870s was not in the ground, it was on the stage. Cody was a natural showman, a charismatic pragmatist who understood that the East Coast audiences possessed a ravenous, insatiable appetite for the romanticized mythology of the frontier. They did not want the grim, silent reality of a man slowly going blind from trachoma. They wanted thrilling, bloodless heroism. They wanted Indians who always lost and cowboys who never missed. Cody, alongside the prolific dime novel author Ned Buntline, had formed a theatrical troupe to deliver exactly that. Their production, a melodramatic spectacle titled Scouts of the Plains, was already touring the major cities of the East, generating vast sums of money from an audience eager to purchase a safe, sanitized thrill. But Cody, a shrewd businessman operating in an increasingly competitive entertainment market, knew the fundamental law of capitalism. You must constantly escalate the product. He needed a new attraction, a centerpiece that carried an undeniable, terrifying authenticity. He needed the man whose name alone sold tens of thousands of dime novels. He needed Wild Bill Hickok. When Cody finally tracked Hickok down and presented his offer, the encounter was not a warm reunion of old prairie brothers. It was a calculated acquisition. Cody did not ask Hickok to contribute to the creative direction of the play, nor did he seek the benefit of his tactical expertise. He offered Hickok a contract to simply exist on a stage. The terms were, on paper, staggering. Hickok was offered a massive weekly salary, an amount that could instantly erase his debts, feed him, and secure his immediate future. To a man who could no longer safely play poker or serve as a lawman, it must have looked like divine intervention. Yet the hidden cost of this contract was absolute devastation. By signing his name, Hickok was agreeing to commodify his own existence. He was selling the rights to his trauma, his lethal history, and his very identity. He was agreeing to be transformed from a sovereign apex predator into a biological artifact, a living museum exhibit shipped east for the amusement of men in tailored suits who had never fired a weapon in anger. It is a profound psychological agony to realize that society values the fictionalized version of your life infinitely more than your actual suffering humanity. Hickok hesitated. He possessed a deep inherent disdain for actors and the artificiality of the stage. He knew instinctively that stepping under those theater lights meant surrendering the silent dignity that had defined his entire adult life. But dignity is a luxury that starving men cannot afford. The physical reality of his failing eyesight, the empty pockets, and the constant gnawing hunger overrode his pride. The eagle of the plains capitulated. He signed the paper. In doing so, he legally endorsed his own transition from a man to a mascot. The journey east was a physical manifestation of his surrender. Hickok boarded a steam locomotive, the very iron beast that was systematically destroying the wild, unfenced frontier that had birthed him. For days he sat in the passenger car, listening to the rhythmic industrial clacking of the wheels over the steel tracks. Every revolution pulled him further from the boundless horizons of the Great Plains, carrying him inexorably toward the suffocating, smoke-choked skies of the industrialized East Coast. He watched through the thick glass of the window as the open prairie, the landscape he had once commanded with terrifying authority, slowly dissolved into dense forests, sprawling factories, and claustrophobic urban landscapes. He was being transported like the very Texas longhorn cattle he used to guard in Abilene, herded into a metal box, shipped across the country, and delivered to the slaughterhouses of New York and Boston. Except Hickok was not destined for the butcher's block. He was destined for the limelight. He was riding toward a cage made of painted canvas, gas lamps, and the suffocating expectations of a paying audience. As the train finally pulled into the massive echoing terminals of the East Coast, the air smelled heavily of burning coal, raw sewage, and unbridled commerce. The open sky was gone. The silence of the plains was dead. James Butler Hickok stepped off the train and walked directly into the meticulously constructed, inescapable trap of the American entertainment industry. The theater spaces of the Eastern Seaboard in the 1870s were opulent temples of escapism, constructed of heavy velvet, polished brass, and imported mahogany. For the wealthy elite of New York and Boston, these buildings were sanctuaries of high society where the brutal realities of the industrial world could be temporarily forgotten. But for James Butler Hickok, the backstage corridors of these grand theaters were a claustrophobic, suffocating labyrinth. The moment he stepped through the stage door, the systematic dismantling of his identity accelerated. The theater management did not want the authentic James Hickok, a quiet, traumatized, visually impaired man in a threadbare coat. They wanted Wild Bill, the blood-soaked caricature that had been relentlessly marketed to the masses. The first phase of this transformation was an act of profound physical humiliation, the wardrobe. On the frontier, Hickok had been a meticulous dresser, favoring tailored broadcloth coats, crisp white shirts, and a subtle silk vest. His clothing was designed for mobility, respectability, and the efficient concealment of his weaponry. It was the uniform of a professional. In the dressing room of the theater, however, that uniform was stripped away. In its place, he was forced into the theatrical interpretation of a frontiersman. It was a grotesque exaggeration, a costume designed by tailors who believed that authenticity simply meant adding more fringe to a garment. They shoved the eagle of the plains into a massive, heavy buckskin suit, heavily embellished with dyed porcupine quills, absurd beadwork, and trailing leather fringes that dragged clumsily when he walked. He was made to wear an oversized sombrero that felt foreign and ridiculous on his head. His legendary ivory-handled Colt revolvers, precision instruments that had dictated life and death in Springfield and Abilene, were replaced with theatrical props, firing blank, anemic charges that produced smoke but no lethal force. When Hickok looked in the dressing room mirror, the reflection staring back at him was not a warrior. It was a clown. It was a dime novel illustration brought to life, a mockery of the harsh, unvarnished existence he had barely survived. He had been reduced from an apex predator to a mascot, dressed up in the skin of his own legend. If the costume was a visual insult, the script was an intellectual and spiritual violation. The play, Scouts of the Plains, was written by Ned Buntline, a prolific hack writer who specialized in churning out sensationalized, wildly inaccurate pulp fiction. The dialogue was a spectacular display of melodramatic garbage. Hickok, a man whose real-life survival had depended on the economy of his words and the silence of his movements, was handed pages of flowery, bombastic speeches. He was expected to stand center stage and loudly proclaim his fabricated heroism, to utter overly romanticized drivel to swooning actresses, and to engage in highly choreographed, fake fist fights with actors playing cartoonish versions of Native Americans. To a man who had actually held a dying friend in his arms, who had smelled the copper scent of real blood in the Kansas dirt, participating in this bloodless, sanitized pantomime was an excruciating psychological torture. He despised the artificiality of it. He loathed the actors who struck heroic poses, but would have fainted at the sound of a genuine gunshot. He was a wolf forced to perform tricks in a petting zoo, surrounded by sheep dressed in wolf's clothing. Yet, the ultimate crucible of his degradation did not come from the costume or the script. It came from the audience. When the heavy velvet curtain finally rose, Hickok stepped out to face a sea of paying customers. These were the beneficiaries of the capitalist machine: bankers, clerks, factory owners, and high society women wrapped in silk. They had paid 50 cents a ticket to safely observe the terrifying savage of the West from the comfort of an upholstered chair. As Hickok stood before them, a massive, imposing figure in his ridiculous buckskins, a heavy silence would fall over the auditorium. The sheer physical presence of the man still carried a residual, dangerous gravity. But then, the script required him to speak. This is where the mythology of Wild Bill collided violently with his biological reality. For decades, the Eastern audiences had consumed literature that described Hickok with a voice like rolling thunder, a deep, resonant baritone that shook the floorboards of saloons. But the historical truth was starkly different. James Butler Hickok possessed a surprisingly high, reedy, almost effeminate voice. It was a light tenor, completely at odds with his towering physique and his lethal reputation. On the chaotic streets of Abilene, that voice was never an issue. When Hickok spoke, men obeyed because of the twin colts on his hips, not the pitch of his vocal cords. But in the acoustics of an Eastern theater, stripped of his real authority and reciting Buntline's atrocious dialogue, the revelation of his true voice was disastrous. As the high, reedy tone echoed through the theater, the audience's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The silence broke. It did not break with applause or gasps of terror. It broke with a ripple of giggles. The giggles cascaded through the velvet seats, swelling into chuckles, and finally erupting into open, amused laughter. The wealthy men in their waistcoats nudged each other. The women hid their smiles behind feathered fans. They were laughing at him, the man who had faced down lynch mobs without a tremor, the marksman who had executed Davis Tutt at 75 yards, was standing center stage, entirely paralyzed by the laughter of accountants and merchants. For a warrior whose entire existence was predicated on commanding absolute respect and instilling mortal fear, this public mockery was a psychic castration. A bullet to the chest is a clean, honest transaction that a frontiersman understands. But the laughter of a theater audience is an invisible, creeping poison that rots the soul. It was a public confirmation of his irrelevance. Every chuckle was a razor blade, cutting away a piece of his dignity. They did not fear him. They found him quaint. They did not respect his survival. They found his vocal cords amusing. Hickok realized, with a crushing, suffocating clarity, that to the capitalist elite of the East, his lifetime of trauma, his lethal skills, and his shattered nerves meant absolutely nothing. He was not a hero to them. He was an exhibit. He was a monkey in a fringe-covered suit, dancing for coins, his terrifying history sterilized and repackaged as a comedy routine for the civilized world. And the most agonizing realization of all was that he had signed the contract. He had walked into the slaughterhouse of his own free will, driven by the whip of poverty, only to find that the machine did not want to kill his body. It wanted to butcher his dignity in front of a paying crowd. The psychological humiliation of his ridiculous costume and terrible script was only a fraction of the torment. The actual physical environment of the 19th century stage violently collided with the deteriorating biology of a broken frontiersman. The Great Plains, for all their lethal hazards and unforgiving weather, were a landscape defined by natural light. The sun was an adversary, certainly, but the nights offered the soothing, infinite darkness of the prairie, a cool respite where a man's senses could rest and recalibrate. But in the grand, enclosed theaters of New York and Boston, the darkness was banished by a terrifying, relatively new industrial invention, the calcium light, universally known as the limelight. This was not the forgiving glow of frontier candlelight. Limelight was a brutal, piercing white beam of incredible intensity created by blasting quicklime with a fiercely burning flame. It cut through the smoky auditorium with the blinding clarity of a contained sun, radiating a blistering heat. For a healthy performer, standing in the limelight was a mark of arrival, a glorious baptism in the center of the public's attention. But for Wild Bill Hickok, stepping into that focused beam was an act of pure, agonizing medical torture. His already failing eyes, battered by disease and the caustic dust of the plains, were completely stripped of their natural defenses. The physiological reality within his retinas was catastrophic. In a healthy eye, the pupil acts as a dynamic aperture, contracting rapidly in bright environments to protect the highly sensitive retina at the back of the eye. But in an eye diseased by elevated intraocular pressure and chronic inflammation, this regulatory mechanism fails. The optic nerve, already being slowly suffocated by the pressure building inside the eyeball, is highly sensitized. Furthermore, the cornea, the clear protective outer layer of the eye, was likely scarred, raw, and ulcerated from years of exposure to the caustic alkaline dust of the plains. When a patient with this specific severe ocular pathology is exposed to a sudden, intense light source, the result is a symptom known as extreme photophobia. But the word photophobia sounds entirely too clinical, too mild to describe the sensation. It is not merely an aversion to light, it is a physical strike. When Hickok walked out from the cool, dim shadows of the stage wings and stepped directly into the unshielded, focused beam of the calcium limelight, it was not an illumination. It was a violent assault on his central nervous system. The sheer kinetic shock of the incandescent beam hitting his diseased retinas translated instantly into pure, radiating pain. It felt as though white-hot needles were being driven directly through his pupils, bypassing his skull and plunging deep into his brain. The nightly routine was a terrifying disorientation. Hickok was expected to stride confidently to the center of the stage, project the aura of the fearless, invincible gunfighter, and stare out into the audience. Instead, the moment the light hit his face, he was plunged into a blinding, white-hot haze. The brilliant glare washed out the entire theater, erasing the audience, the orchestra pit, and the edges of the stage, leaving him isolated in a burning void of white light. His diseased eyes would immediately begin to water uncontrollably, the tears stinging the inflamed tissues with salt. A heavy, rhythmic, sickening throb would begin at the base of his skull, echoing the beat of his own heart. Yet, he could not close his eyes. He could not turn away. He was contractually obligated to stand exactly on his mark, bathed in the agonizing heat of the quicklime, and recite Ned Buntline's flowery, idiotic dialogue. He had to pretend to be a romantic hero while his body was screaming in sheer physical agony. Every second he spent in that focused beam, the intense ultraviolet radiation and the blinding glare were actively accelerating the decay of his optic nerve. The lighting system that the theater management had installed to celebrate the legend of Wild Bill was literally acting as an instrument of biological destruction. It was incinerating his remaining vision, night after night, show after show. The cruelty of this arrangement was compounded by the absolute ignorance of the audience. The wealthy patrons, sitting comfortably in the dim auditorium, saw the great eagle of the plains squinting heavily under the lights. They saw his brow furrowed, his eyes narrowed to thin slits. In their naive, romanticized understanding of the West, they likely interpreted this as the rugged, menacing stare of a killer, the trademark grimace of a man who had stared down death on the frontier. They did not know they were watching a man desperately trying to shield his dying retinas. They did not realize that the magnificent theatrical spectacle they had paid 50 cents to witness was actively blinding the man they had come to admire. The capitalist entertainment machine was not merely purchasing Hickok's time and his dignity, it was literally consuming his eyesight, burning it away as fuel to keep the box office receipts flowing. Human endurance has absolute, unbreakable limits. A man cannot sustain a life where his waking hours are divided between the deep psychological humiliation of being laughed at by an audience and the excruciating physical torture of the stage lights without seeking an escape hatch. Hickok could not quit the play. His crippling poverty and the ironclad nature of his contract bound him to the stage. He could not complain to the theater management. In the brutal economics of the 19th century stage, an actor who could not perform was simply discarded, and Hickok had nowhere else to go. Surrounded by enemies he could not shoot and a society he could not understand, he turned to the only reliable medicine available on the frontier for a man in unbearable pain. He turned to whiskey. Hickok had always been a drinking man. In the saloons of Hays City and Abilene, alcohol was a social lubricant, a way to pass the long, tense hours between cattle drives, a method to slightly dull the hypervigilance that kept him alive. But in the suffocating theaters of the East, his relationship with liquor underwent a dark, fundamental mutation. He stopped drinking for pleasure, or for camaraderie, or for taste. He began drinking as a desperate, industrial-grade anesthetic. He needed a chemical barrier between his consciousness and the reality of his existence. The whiskey of the 1870s was often harsh, unrefined, and potent, a raw distillation of grain that burned the throat and hit the stomach with the force of a physical blow. For Hickok, that burn became the only reliable comfort in his world. It was a mechanism to rapidly depress his central nervous system, to slow the frantic, panicked firing of his synapses. He needed the alcohol to dull the sharp edges of the physical pain radiating from his eyes. If he drank enough, the throbbing behind his temples would subside into a manageable, heavy ache. He needed the alcohol to drown out the sound of the audience's mocking laughter. If he was sufficiently intoxicated, the giggles of the Eastern elite sounded far away, muffled, as if they were happening to someone else in another room. He needed the liquor to numb his own pride, to make it easier to put on the ridiculous oversized buckskin coat with the trailing fringes, to step out into the blinding light and recite lines that made his stomach turn. The descent into the bottle was rapid and devastating. The daily cycle of his life became a grueling marathon of self-medication. He would wake up in his boarding house room with a crushing hangover, his eyes glued shut with infected mucus, his body trembling with the withdrawal of the alcohol and the mounting dread of the evening's performance. To simply get out of bed and face the day, he had to start drinking. He would take a heavy pull of whiskey in the morning just to steady his hands. By the time he arrived at the theater in the late afternoon, he was already carrying a heavy functional buzz. But as the call for the curtain drew closer, the functional buzz was no longer enough. The terror of the limelight required a deeper numbness. He began drinking heavily in the dressing room, sitting in the dim light, pouring shot after shot down his throat as the stagehands rushed past his door. He kept a flask concealed deep within the pockets of his theatrical buckskins, taking secret, desperate swigs in the shadowy wings of the stage just moments before his cue. The tragic irony of this self-destruction was that it began to erode the very physical attributes that had made him a legend in the first place. James Butler Hickok, the man who had possessed a terrifying, feline grace, the man who could draw and fire a heavy Colt revolver with mathematical precision in a fraction of a second, was slowly being transformed into a staggering, uncoordinated drunk. The alcohol was poisoning his liver, destroying his fine motor skills, and clouding his already fractured mind. When he finally stepped into the limelight, he was no longer the steady, icy warlord of Abilene. He was a man fighting a losing battle against gravity and intoxication. He began to stumble over the intricately painted wooden stage props. He slurred Ned Buntline's melodramatic dialogue, his tongue thick and uncooperative. He would miss his cues, staring blankly out into the blinding white haze, his mind drifting away on a tide of cheap liquor. Sometimes he would simply stop acting altogether, leaning heavily against a piece of scenery, his eyes closed behind his tinted glasses, trying to keep his balance while the other actors desperately tried to improvise around him. To the audience, it might have seemed like a remarkably poor performance from an overrated frontier hero. To Buffalo Bill Cody and the frustrated theater managers, it was a breach of contract, a nuisance that threatened their ticket sales. They yelled at him, threatened him, and tried to manage his alcohol intake, but they completely missed the profound, agonizing truth of the situation. They were looking at a broken employee. They failed to see a man who was actively torturing himself just to survive their employment. Hickok was not drinking because he lacked discipline. He was self-medicating himself into a near comatose stupor because it was the only possible way to endure a few hours of absolute physical and emotional hell. He was a prisoner, locked in a gilded cage, using poison to survive the daily torment of the limelight. The magnificent, lethal eagle of the plains had been reduced to a stumbling, blinded alcoholic, slowly drinking himself to death under the roaring applause of a society that loved the myth of Wild Bill, but cared absolutely nothing for the agony of James Butler Hickok. There is a dangerous threshold in the psychology of any apex predator. You can corner a wolf, you can starve it, and you can even force it into a cage. But the moment you demand that it forget its own nature, the illusion of control shatters. By the spring of 1874, James Butler Hickok had reached that absolute threshold. The relentless daily cocktail of public humiliation, the excruciating physical pain from the stage lights, and the numbing, desperate haze of whiskey had finally boiled over into a quiet, deadly outrage. The history books often romanticize rebellion as a loud, dramatic clash of ideals, complete with shouting matches and torn contracts. But Hickok was not a theatrical man. His rebellion on the eastern stages was not a spoken monologue, it was a physical threat. He decided that if the audience and the producers demanded the genuine Wild Bill, he would stop acting and give them exactly what they paid for. His sabotage was subtle at first, but absolutely terrifying to those who shared the stage with him. The melodramatic script regularly called for Hickok to engage in mock shootouts with extras dressed as Native American warriors. Traditionally, actors fired their black powder blanks safely into the air or toward the back of the set. Hickok, however, began dropping his aim. He started firing his heavy revolvers dangerously close to the legs and feet of the other actors. The searing muzzle flash would singe their theatrical leggings. The concussive blast of the powder at close range would rattle their bones. The extras were no longer acting out their fear. They were genuinely terrified that the staggering, half-blind gunfighter had forgotten they were in a play. Hickok was actively dismantling the safe, sanitized illusion of the theater, injecting the cold, unpredictable violence of the real frontier directly into the artificial narrative. But the ultimate target of his deep oppressed grievance was the limelight itself. The blinding calcium beam was the literal and metaphorical manifestation of his torture. One evening, trapped yet again under the suffocating, agonizing glare of the lights, the final breaking point arrived. Hickok drew his weapon, not at a fellow actor, but directly at the source of his misery. He raised his revolver and fired, deliberately shooting out the searing spotlight that was burning his retinas. The glass exploded outward. The stage was plunged into a sudden, shocking darkness. The comfortable laughter of the Eastern elite was instantly replaced by the sharp, acrid smell of real sulfur and the panicked silence of a crowd that suddenly realized the caged animal had just broken its lock. That single gunshot was the definitive resignation of James Butler Hickok. There was no grand theatrical screaming match with Buffalo Bill Cody. The reality was far more solemn and final. In March 1874, Hickok simply gathered his few remaining possessions, turned his back on the immense wealth and the suffocating velvet curtains of the East Coast, and walked away. He had stared into the heart of the capitalist entertainment machine and recognized it for what it truly was, an industrial slaughterhouse for the human spirit. He chose to reclaim his dignity, even if it meant reclaiming absolute poverty. He boarded a train heading west, returning to the harsh, unforgiving territories that were rapidly moving on without him. He made a conscious, fatal choice. He would rather be a starving drifter in the western dust than a wealthy, blinded clown under the theater lights. The journey back west was not a triumphant return of a king. It was the slow funeral march of a ghost. By the summer of 1876, James Butler Hickok drifted into the lawless gold rush camp of Deadwood, nestled deep in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. Deadwood was a chaotic, mud-soaked settlement that mirrored the violent cattle towns he had commanded a decade earlier. But Hickok was no longer a commander. He was 39 years old, yet his body carried the mileage of a brutal century. His famous eyesight was nearly gone, reduced to a hazy blur that forced him to rely on the vague shapes of shadows and the sound of footsteps. The man who once terrorized the frontier was now surviving largely on the charity of old friends and a reputation that felt heavier with every passing day. He was a relic, wandering through a world that had stolen his youth, sold his legend, and left him with nothing but the creeping darkness. On the sweltering afternoon of August 2nd, 1876, Hickok walked into Nuttall and Mann's Saloon number 10 to play poker. The saloon was crowded, and the only available seat forced him to do the one thing he had meticulously avoided his entire adult life. He sat with his back to the open door. It was a fatal concession from a man who was simply too exhausted to keep fighting the inevitable. As he studied his cards, squinting through the dim light of the saloon, a drifter named Jack McCall walked through the entrance. McCall was a nobody, a pathetic figure seeking the instant, unearned notoriety that came with killing a legend. He stepped up quietly behind Hickok, drew a .45 caliber revolver, and fired a single shot into the back of Hickok's head. Death was instantaneous. As Hickok slumped forward onto the table, his fingers slipped from the cards he was holding, a pair of black aces and a pair of black eights. It was a combination that history would forever brand as the dead man's hand. Jack McCall's bullet ended James Butler Hickok's life, but it did not kill him. The true murder had taken place years earlier, executed not with gunpowder, but with contracts and blinding limelights. The capitalist entertainment machine had taken a sovereign, breathing man and hollowed him out, extracting his trauma to manufacture a cheap commodity. When his physical body broke down under the weight of their exploitation, they simply let him wander off into the darken to die. Hickok's life stands as a brutal indictment of the machinery of fame, revealing a terrifying truth. No amount of physical courage can defeat an industry that measures human worth entirely in ticket sales. We are left with the haunting image of the West's greatest gunfighter, blinded, broken, and waiting for a bullet that was, in the end, an act of mercy. It forces us to ask one final devastating question. When our legends are bought, sold, and bled dry for our entertainment, what remains of the human being underneath? Nothing but a borrowed coat, a pair of black aces, and a silence that we, the audience, purchased with our applause.